So prospective theorizing and speculative rigour. So this is part of a series of papers that I have worked over the last couple of years with co-authors, particularly with Ali Gümüşay, and also on impactful theorizing with Eva Boxenbaum and Juliane. So we started really by questioning ourselves that whether our forms of theorizing that we have developed so far that are very advanced, and as qualitative scholars, as myself, and also working on grand challenges like sustainability, human rights, there has in mainstream journals evolved much more of a space to publish articles that address these topics. So we have gained tremendous ground, definitely since I started my own career in academia, where, with sustainability, grand challenges wasn't such an accepted topic for management scholarship. And qualitative research was also a little less accepted. So I think we have come a really long way. But I wonder whether to address the looming challenges that we have, such as the climate emergency, the rise of AI, societal rising inequalities, post-truth society, whether the type and the form of theorizing that we have developed is still adequate for the type of challenges that we are facing. Part of that started with kind of an interest in, if we want to have impact. And I know with Ibrat, you have done quite a few seminars on the question of impact previously, and I had the big pleasure with my co-authors Eva and Joel to present on impactful theories, pathways to mattering before. But just to kind of think about the impetus where this is coming from, I was at COP in December in Dubai, and I really had an aha moment because I visited a lot of seminars and presentations, and I was really struck by the absence of management scholars. And I was wondering, where's management scholarship? Where are we to contribute something to this debate? I had a lot of my colleagues here from Oxford University, from the Oxford Net Zero interdisciplinary research group, who presented kind of, the Oxford offsetting principles, or what credible net zero looks like. And I was really kind of struck, what's our role as management scholars in this very, very important debate? And if you remember, the COP that took place was also named the COP for business, because now we really demand businesses to come to the forefront of the transition to net zero economy, or actually net positive and regenerative economy. But where are we in this debate? How can we guide businesses to play an important role in this transition? And partly it might be that our theorizing, the tools of theorizing that we have, might not be entirely adequate for these kind of new challenges that we're facing. Maybe it's time for us as management scholars to assume a new role, to be, seeking impact, but also theorizing in a different way. And this is kind of the idea that maybe our theorizing has overall become more incremental and less disruptive, is not just an observation that management scholars have made, but applies to science in general. A paper that was published last year in Nature by Park and other scholars have looked at scientific output in life science and biomedicine, physical sciences, social sciences, technology, and have concluded that science is becoming less disruptive. The scientific output, we're publishing more and more, but what we publish is actually less disruptive. It's becoming more incremental. And this at a time when actually we need more disruptive theorizing. Also in our own discipline, colleagues have lamented that maybe we're stuck in kind of a, in gap spotting. We spot gaps in the theory, and we are kind of stuck in a narrow paradigm-driven theory fetish. We emphasize theory over phenomena. hand on heart, right? Because I'm an associate editor at Academy of Management Journal, where very much we require theoretical contributions, and I have to push my authors to produce theoretical contributions. But at the same time, I ask myself, how can we maybe if we want to produce theory, and we as scholars, our main output is theory and theorizing, maybe there are different forms of how we can produce theory that can be more disruptive and can play a bigger role in these important societal debates that's where we want to become more a part of. Impactful theory, I think we should not see impact and theory as two opposites or as an oxymoron. Good theory is vital to creating impact. Impact, just to get our definitions right, is a societal benefit beyond the realm of academia, so not necessarily the scholarly impact, but kind of the societal impact. There's this move towards greater relevance, engaged scholarship in our discipline. But how do we do this? So the suggestion that me and my co-authors like Ali have made is to move to kind of maybe a new form of prospective theorizing that is about co-creating desirable institutions of the future. So we can maybe create societal relevance through theorizing these desirable institutions, but this requires quite a shift in how we approach theorizing. So we need to move in our engagement with the future, from predicting the future to a more form of co-creating the future. And I think that's especially relevant in a time where generative AI, ChatGPT are coming forward with immense capabilities to not just gather data, but even analyze data. They can code data for us. They can create models for us. So in a sense, our analytic capabilities, they are increasingly dwarfed by often corporate-driven big data applications. And so predicting the future based on data that has occurred in the past is maybe not good enough anymore for us both to kind of, maintain a unique, unique capability as scientists, but also for really guiding a future that is, due to the climate emergency, due to AI, is going to look increasingly different from the past. Yes, so we cannot theorize based on past data, which is what generative AI is doing, using past data to create predictions of the future. We also need critical reflection and, I would argue, a normative orientation to theorizing. And again, that is something that technology cannot replace us with. Hence a call for prospective theorizing. So let's look at kind of what we mean by theorizing, and then let's look at what we mean by prospection. So theory has been defined as a statement of relations among concepts within a set of boundary assumptions and constraints. So this is a very traditional statement of theorizing or theory. We could also expand this definition to a more active form of looking at the production of theory. So moving from a noun to a verb to theorizing, which is a scholarly work that researchers do in the pursuit of making informed knowledge claims. So Joep Cornelissen and Marcus Höllerer and David Seidel have published a fantastic paper in organization theory, looking at different forms and different styles of theorizing. So not just theorizing through models, but also through critical inquiry, and kind of really trying to open up and encouraging greater pluralism in theorizing. Now, the conundrum, if you want to theorize about the future, is that by definition, the future is not present yet. So we cannot really, based on collecting data, we cannot really source data about the future. Our data that we use to theorize from is by definition always already backward looking. So the data is sourced from observable events that have already occurred. So data is inherently backward looking. So how can we theorize from backward looking data into the future? But the radical uncertainty that we face about the future also challenges us because we can no longer project forward from the present. It's not good enough. But this is the conundrum. Can we theorize the future before it actually happens? What would this look like? Is this actually desirable? Is this scientifically rigorous? How can we conceptualize and theorize what is not yet observable? And this is where prospective theorizing comes in. So we define prospective theorizing as a future-oriented approach to theorizing that is concerned with imagining desirable futures. And I will unpack this definition as I go along in this presentation a little bit further. But it kind of forms part of an emerging future-forming orientation to research, where a number of other scholars have already made important contribution to thinking what could this look like. And prospective theorizing, if we just take this notion apart, we already took theorizing apart, what means prospection. So Laszlo in his paper defined prospection as the mental representation and evaluation of possible futures. So it's engagement of, what could the future be? It's not here yet, so we kind of mentally represent it and evaluate it as well. So again, kind of normative component here as well. It also builds on a recent interest in an organizational study with concern of future making. So not about anticipating, predicting the future, but acknowledging the role of actors in making the future by creating representations of the future, such as imaginary, this wonderful paper by Grace Augustine on geoengineering, creating these as-if imaginaries. And so scholars have talked about a future-forming orientation to research, such as Gergen, generative scholarship, Paves et al., and have developed kind of different pillars of what generative scholarship might look like based on should be inspiring, discovering, envisioning, activating, savoring. So there's kind of an emerging stream of scholars that kind of rethink our past orientation and trying to move us to this future orientation. At the very heart of this move towards prospection is the recognition that human behavior is not just a function of past patterns and events, but is equally shaped by prospective images of the future. If you think about the work of Jens Beckert on futures as an economic sociologist, he basically said, well, if you really want to understand, what drives behavior of actors in markets, it's not necessarily what we previously thought in economic sociology. It's kind of these, past behaviors that shape how actors behave. But a lot of market behavior is actually inspired by prospective images of the future of lots of institutions that are quite future-oriented. For instance, discounted cash flow. Our imagination of what is value is based on what is the value of an asset, an investment, a firm in the future. And then we discount it backwards. So there are all these kind of future-oriented assumptions that actually shape our behavior. So there's kind of this broader engagement in kind of our scholarship with the future and with theorizing in particular. So this also questions in a more fundamental way what we build theory about and for what. And we could think about maybe 3 criteria that also reorient the purpose of theorizing a little bit. And the first one is aligning very much with pragmatist philosophy that challenges the pursuit of truth as a fixed and objective property of beliefs or propositions, but says, well, this is not what theorizing is necessarily, or theory is necessarily about, truthful representations of reality. Instead, the focus becomes more on what are the practical consequences of theorizing and of theory. So it moves from kind of truth as an objective property to the question of usefulness as a pragmatic criterion. And usefulness is very much also dependent on the context in which a theory emerges and is used. And it also becomes, so theory has a different purpose, from representation to more intervening in the world, a technique for coping with a complex, uncertain world. And that kind of moves into the second part, which is about preparatory. So theory is also preparing us as society for plausible and also implausible futures and possibilities. What might a world of climate emergency look like? And maybe even if you think about things that seem quite implausible, like a global pandemic, all of a sudden it happens. So even thinking about the implausible, about potential counterfactual futures, might be quite useful. So science on that account, as Wicks and Freeman suggested, might be one more technique, albeit a very useful and powerful one, for coping with the world. Finally, theory also becomes prefigurative. So theorizing itself is about changing the future through thinking, theorizing desirable futures. So theorizing is becoming a form of future making, of intervening into the world. And that's what also impactful theory is about. And that connects with scholars on performativity who have observed how theories become performative often as an unintended consequence of theorizing. But here very much performativity might be embraced as one of bringing the theory into being. So it's the constitution of new worlds through their articulation. So that would be kind of shifting what we want to reach with or achieve with theorizing. So I'm just monitoring quickly the chat to see if there are any questions. How's prospective theorizing validated? We will get to that question towards the end. So I will take that as we go through, and we can also discuss this collectively. So prospective theorizing, we suggest, involves two conceptual leaps. I really like the work by Anne Langley, who talks about all theorizing involves some type of conceptual leap. Theorizing is not just a purely mechanical application of certain methodological tools, but is about making an inference or conceptual leap from the phenomenon to the theoretical concept. So there's a certain creativity involved. Here, the suggested leap is of slightly different nature. It's about a conceptual leap into the future and towards embracing normativity as well. We can analytically separate these two leaps, so let me just do this here. So prospective theorizing would involve a leap from values-neutral claims to values-led claims. Values neutrality has, of course, been a long-standing debate in the social science in particular. And you could argue that there's no theory that is perfectly values neutral. Max Weber suggested that in our selection of what we study, the researchers' value orientations come very much to bear. So no theory is completely neutral. By the time we select a dependent variable, if we take economic growth, revenue, performance as a variable, we implicitly make a value judgment of what is it that is that is a desirable outcome. But here, the shift is kind of from maybe more assuming or striving towards values neutrality towards embracing values-led claims. And it aligns with a number of scholars who have argued that we need to counteract the dominance of Western, patriarchal, capitalist values in knowledge production that are often implicitly underpinning our theorization, but are not often explicitly expressed. And it's also about embracing the generative potential of developing institutional imaginaries and alternatives. The second conceptual leap would be the leap from projection to imagination. So projection is kind of a forward projection from the past and present, taking the data that we have, the factual data of now, and projecting it forward. So if you think about I mentioned discounted cash flows, kind of projecting forward firm value and then discounting it back as one form of projecting the future. Yet this is based on the present. So the knowledge is kind of grounded in the past and present data. So it doesn't really get us away from the challenge that the future will look radically different from the present. So it's a leap from projection to imagination. It departs from empirical reality. And imagination is here the ability to form pictures in one's mind of something that cannot be immediately sensed or that has not been previously perceived. Okay, I'm just looking if there are any questions in the chat that I can immediately talk about. What is an example of prospective theorizing? And we'll come to that as well. Before getting there, I just want to present the modes of theorizing futures based on this double leap that we can take. So on the we have an axis of axiological orientation and one onto-epistemological orientation from projection to imagination. So mode one would be about projecting factual futures. So that would be kind of a more traditional form of how we engage with the future. We project forward from what we think is the case now, the data that we have, and we can think about maybe different types of scenarios. So maybe forecasting would be based in this mode one. So this is kind of a spectrum of different forms. It's not to say that, you know, if we don't make these leaps, we cannot think about prospective theorizing. But the argument is the more we get to mode 4, the more we kind of can unleash the potential of prospective theorizing. Mode 2 would be moving from projection towards imagination, and it's about imagining factual futures or counterfactual futures. Mode 3, it stays within kind of the projection, and it would be about projecting desirable futures. Mode 4, which achieves a double leap towards imagination and towards normative orientation, that would be the mode towards desirable futures. And I give you one example because I think that's what you've been asking me in the chat. So one example could be what my colleague Kate Raworth at the University of Oxford in economics has developed, and that's donut economics. At the heart of donut economics is the planetary boundaries as a scientific or a science-led boundary to what the kind of carrying capacity of our planet is in terms of the pollution it can withstand. And the resource extraction it can withstand. So the planetary boundaries, I'm sure you've all seen the framework by Rockstrom et al. Kate Raworth takes it further and builds a social foundation to this. So we have an economy that operates within kind of the safe and just space for humanity. The safe space is defined by the ecological ceiling around it, the planetary boundaries. But there's also a social foundation that is about meeting the needs of humanity, very much at the heart of the definition, the Brundtland definition of sustainable development as a development that meets the needs of future generations. So the social foundation of the economy is meeting the needs of current and future generations. So we struggle with a shortfall towards meeting the needs and an overshoot of these planetary boundaries, and that kind of defines the safe space for regenerative and distributive economy. And so this is kind of a very different form of theorizing, right? Because we could argue that donut economics, it's an imaginary economics. It doesn't quite exist yet. Similar to how the circular economy does not fully exist yet, but it's a very, very powerful metaphor that can inspire theorizing, and that also inspires business models, corporate transformation, towards circular economy models, towards regenerative models. And that is one example of how we can think about prospective theorizing, about kind of more developing these types of imaginary tools that can inspire action going forward. So with the example of the donut economics in mind, we can then think about different theorizing practices of how we can achieve the double leap. And if we just take the typical steps of theorizing, the input of theorizing, the data collection, the throughput of theorizing, the moment of data analysis, and then the output of theorizing, which, in traditional theorizing is maybe the theoretical model or the theoretical framework. So if you take the input of theorizing in a shift towards imagination, we could maybe think about imaginatory forms of data. Anmish talks about sites of hyperprojectivity, where, for instance, the People's Summit at the Rio Climate Convention, where in a participatory situations, citizens and stakeholders are encouraged to imagine what a desirable future looks like. So one could think about these kind of future labs to create situations where such data is generated through kind of deliberative, situated imagination of people. And the shift towards values, that could also be around more deliberative, purposeful, co-created value that is being generated. The throughput of theorizing could also take quite different forms. One is the form of thought experiments, which has already been proposed and theorized about, both in philosophy, but also in our own theorizing. So thought experiment is a cognitive exercise or mental simulation in which researchers contemplate a hypothetical scenario or problem to explore and analyze its implications. So it's kind of broadly defined as, what if thinking, including counterfactual futures. So the advantage of thought experiments is that it doesn't require practical experimentation or real-world testing. It can remain a thought experiment in collective deliberations. And that really builds on how scientific achievements in other disciplines are reached, where many of the greatest advances in science have actually relied on thought experiments. If you think about, quantum physics or, rethinking the standard theory of physics, it very much relies on thought experiments because we don't have powerful enough physical laboratories to actually test the theory, or they're now being built, like the Large Hadron Collider was trying to test what had been a thought experiment in physics about the standard model. So maybe we can learn from science to actually also use more thought experiments to advance our own theorizing. It could also be in the shift towards values, we could think about rethinking the values maybe that we assume as our dependent variable. Do we need to have revenue and performance as our dependent variable? Or maybe we could think about regeneration or greater equality or net zero or even a net positive impact as the dependent variable that we want to theorize about. Finally, the output of theorizing maybe does not necessarily have to be a model that is trying to represent processes, causal relationships, but maybe it could more along the lines of images, metaphors like the donut economy, narratives or analogies that inspire more open-ended imagination. So what might the donut economy look like? Could be one such theoretical output. And towards a shift of towards values, I also think the donut economy also illustrates kind of visible normative assumptions and postulates, namely what is an overshoot and what is a shortfall. So these are kind of normative assumptions that we want to meet societal needs. Okay, I see the chat is quite active. I think, should we open up to some questions that have come up at the moment, and then we kind of come back in, because I think there were some that that have been posed.
Sure, we can do that. How do you want to select the questions yourself, or do we work with raising hands as you want?
Maybe do you want to moderate and take some of the questions?
Yeah, sure. A question that has come up a few times already is one of concrete examples of prospective theories that meet your criteria. So I think you've given the donut, but maybe also more related to management, maybe some examples there.
So I think in a sense, we're breaking new ground with prospective theorizing. And I think where we maybe have moved towards some form of prospective theorizing that nevertheless still relies on data that exist, is scholars who have worked on real utopias. So the utopias, because they kind of try to imagine a different kind of, economy, maybe economic collectives of what could be possible, but they're real because they're already instantiated, albeit at a small scale, in some real world. So we have some examples of real utopias, prefigurative organizing that try to, or that study experiments in organizing that try to instantiate the future society that they want to bring about at a larger stage. I myself looked at the Occupy movement as a protest camp that tried to, at a small scale, kind of recreate a society that is more equal. So I think what we have not quite. So these are kind of examples that make the move towards kind of incorporating values, but it's not yet based on kind of imagination, because it uses what exists in the present. Now we could try in our theorizing and further extrapolate from that and say, okay, what if these real utopias, what if this small scale example of this small social enterprise that creates a circular economy, what if we scale this up? What if this were to work in a different context? So that could be examples that we could take. But I think in a sense, this is really a collective endeavor to create theorizing that is disruptive, which is different from how we have theorized in the past. And in that sense, it's an invitation, a collective invitation to our field to kind of create a receptive community of scholars who are going to help each other to kind of develop this type of prospective theorizing. So I wish if I just had a template and say, okay, this is how we do it. I think that would be wonderful, but our job would be done. So, and I think that's the beauty of being a research community where different scholars can contribute different things to the debate. And hence it's very much an open invitation to kind of try out different forms of how might this actually look like.
Do you want to take a few more questions? I have
let's
one of Mira on dystopias. Mira, if you want to speak up and ask your question, and maybe after that we can still hear from Fritjof if I pronounce that correctly.
Hello, it's Mira here. My video is not working. I was just wondering if we could have a future that is this. We imagine a future which is more nuanced, and how could we theorize in a more nuanced way, if that makes sense.
Can you elaborate what you mean in a more nuanced way?
Well, I mean, we say imaginary futures, right? Like the utopian future would be kind of one side, and a dystopian future would be the opposite. But really, from experience in practice, very often we sort of get an aspect of both kind of imagined worlds that come into things. So, how do we balance these visions? How do we offer a path forward which is pragmatic in a way, more meaningful in a way, rather than value laden and skewed in either direction, right?
Yeah, 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 and I think I think that's a good point, because the further away the future is, the more difficult it becomes to imagine the future and to imagine it in kind of greater nuance. So I think, again, we could think about some strategies of some that are data-based, such as looking at real utopias where we already see some instantiation of the future. Or if you follow the, Gibson's notion that the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed, we could also think about going to places where we see glimpses of the future. So there are already many places in the world, for instance, that experience catastrophic flooding in Brazil at the moment, or even in Germany, there's flooding at the moment, or where economies are already disruptive due to climate change, such as skiing as a winter sports, and where local industry depend on snow, which is no longer guaranteed, or agricultural crops. So I think we can also think about these kind of extreme cases where the future manifests itself already in ways that we don't really see elsewhere. To kind of get to this granularity of what does this mean. I think the nuance of the future will have to come in by focusing on ultimately maybe smaller parts of the puzzle. So if we look at maybe the donut economy, that's kind of a big imaginative framework. But we as scholars, we could, for instance, then say, how can we theorize like certain aspects of a regenerative economy? What would this look like? What would be kind of our maybe thinking about criteria of how we could judge future positive impact. How do we overcome temporal challenges, thinking about the needs of future generations? So I think it's kind of passing out more concrete research questions within kind of a broader framework that can then kind of contribute to kind of a broader theory around maybe maybe donut economics, or maybe some other bigger framework. Yeah.
Great.
Next?
Yes, sure.
Yeah. So originally my question was kind of like around how you validate this kind of prospective theorizing. But in the meantime, you somewhat answered this with the role of experimentation and thought experiments. And I wonder, why limit yourself to thought experiments? So because I think if you move from a representational to a performative approach, field experiments, textual experiments, design experiments would come much closer. So I feel a bit, this paper might also give people again legitimacy to not actually start acting, but just do prospective theorizing because it feels so safe, and then I don't have to actually act. So
Yeah.
how do you validate this kind of theorizing?
Yeah, yeah. I like the idea of action-oriented theorizing field experiments, which I see as kind of an increasing approach in development economics, for instance, to actually go out there and create field experiments, create interventions, and so on. I think what I'm a little bit I think it depends a bit what type of field experiments, because I think often if you do a field experiment, you're very much constrained by the context in which you're operating. So what you can actually test in a field experiment might be, or it might not work because the contextual factors are such that it's very difficult to test very imaginative concepts. So, I mean, I'm not an expert in field experiments, but from what I've seen,
but I think,
Go ahead.
But I think it's not a bug, it's a feature. Like reality can't be so easily shaped. And if we want to have impact, we need to learn how to shape it, how to change it, and all of that. So I think like it's the opposite. It's like that's the hard part. So okay, but thank you.
Yeah, no, I really like that idea. I think what I wanted to say is that it's not about all types of field experiments. I think it has to be about field experiments that are quite that really try to co-create in kind of more radical ways. I'm thinking, for instance, Tima Bansala has done a lot of work with Innovation North and really trying to to co-work with companies and take them on kind of a transformatory journey, which is which they have written about with Garima Sharma and AMJ recently, kind of to think about how can we engage companies in kind of a journey together, and maybe that's kind of and this can be maybe more slightly more radical form of co-creation almost, and action research, rather than within a very narrow kind of we want to test our results in a field experiment. I think that's more where I'm getting at. Yeah. But generally, I think the action orientation element, I think, is a very important part of it. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I'll get to the validation as well.
All right. I think there's a lot of interesting questions still in the chat. There is a few raised hands. I don't know how many you still want to take, but I suggest maybe we can proceed with the people who have raised their hands for now.
Let's do that.
And so maybe Adam, I will let you ask your question.
Sure. Hi. Thanks, Juliane, for the presentation. Really interesting stuff. I actually read the paper and even wrote about it on my Substack, and so I've really dived into this material and I've listened to you carefully. And I must say, I'm in full support of engaged scholarship, having an impact, not having a future orientation, taking management scholarship in that direction. The sort of usefulness of the work, intervening in the social reality, none of that is in dispute. But my question is really about this notion of theorizing in a different way, and values-led theorizing. So the question is, whose values? Or if we don't have the same values, come up with different theories. Doesn't that really kind of make a nonsense of what theory is? I'm not going to fall into some kind of empiricist objective view of the world. I completely understand that all theories are value laden. But if you say a values-led theory, doesn't that just take us down to the level where it's my values or your values or my values and the values of a farmer in Texas or a bureaucrat in China or some, aren't we then just in a sort of furious struggle over values and down we go? And isn't theory something that's trying to build us out of that to get to a set of, well, what is theory? I'm not even sure I fully agree with the definitions that you put up there. I think theory is slightly different, but ultimately theory is trying to explain what is. And theory, by the way, is predictive. If you've got a good theory, it will work when you have new data because the theory will hold, and you will then have, so theories are not, they're also future oriented. But so just to focus this question, if we have a values-led theory, why are we not just having a contest over values?
Yeah. I think that is of course a very important question. Coming back to very big debates in the philosophy of social sciences. I think I mean, I think about values, whose values. I think at the moment it's quite clear that we privilege certain values in our theorizing that are driven by an idea that we want economic growth. So we theorize on.
Wait, Juliana, we lost your sound.
We don't hear you. Okay, sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, sorry, I don't know what happened. Okay, sorry. About values. So I think it would be important to kind of make the value assumption explicit, to say a value assumption or normative orientation could be rather than revenue maximization, it's about regeneration, or it is about protecting common pool resources, right? So this is kind of a normative aim that is kind of that is made. And so if I think about, I mean, I'm a big fan of Elinor Ostrom's collective action theory, so she has done a lot of work on how kind of small scale communities can overcome collective action dilemma. And then she developed a set of organizing principles. So now these are kind of values led to the extent that there's kind of a normative assumption there that we want to overcome these collective action dilemma, and that the market might not be the only and not the best way to overcome such dilemma, but that we place a value on communities themselves to resolve them, right? So this is also kind of a values come in here. And then we can, or she derived certain principles for community-based governance, for polycentric governance, as she called it. So that's kind of what I mean for values, that they can give normative orientation for organizing going forward. Or values now, if you think about the emergence of carbon markets, carbon credits, what is a good carbon market? What is good carbon credits? Are we just going to look at what is, how are these markets evolving? Or can we also look with a more normative angle and say, what should these markets ideally achieve, and are they achieving what they should be achieving, and what might credible or good markets for carbon look like? I mean, just to take an example, I think surely we would need the process of how we theorize, make sure that's deliberative and involves different kind of stakeholder perspectives in developing these theories. And ultimately, we also probably need some sort of guardrails, such as or common understanding. Maybe like our colleagues in medicine pledge an oath. Hippocratic oath. Maybe we need something similar to kind of hold us to the standard, to kind of wanting to further the common good. But I think the assumption that our theories are devoid of values, and we should not be allowed to give also normative guidance to what a desirable future, a desirable business model should look like, I think is very limiting in this regard.
So is that really a new way of theorizing, or is that not just building the theoretical base for a positive social and environmental perspective on the world and critiquing the other positions? I'm not sure I fully understand why this is a new way of theorizing rather than using the standard way of theorizing to create a positive social agenda and critique the various forces that exist in the world that are counter to that.
I mean, I think there are like different forms of theorizing, and some might go more into that direction than others, for sure. For instance, critical theory and critical management scholars building on this has a much bigger orientation towards values and towards exercising critique, which is of course based on a normative standpoint. So yes, we do have that. And so I think here the idea of prospective theorizing is hence the spectrum of we can probably have different forms within that, and some might be more based on what we're already doing, and some might be more disruptive or more novel in the way that we both move towards normativity and towards imagination, where we don't rely on already existing data. So it's more, I would think about more as a spectrum than kind of as a binary move. So it's about opening up kind of for greater pluralism in theorizing.
So that, sorry, I don't mean to dominate this, but that just means, okay, pluralism, so your empirical base or your scope of where you're looking or who you're including in the theory building is broadened and is more democratic, right? And is clearly, as you say, values acknowledging. And that's all great. It just seems to me that's a normal, usual way of doing theory, just making it inclusive, making it democratic, making it values forward. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
I think we should. Thanks so much. Thanks so much. I mean, let's open up towards other questions as well, because I still see some hands up.
I see Andreas Scherer who has a question.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much. This was very interesting, very inspiring to me. I have a few questions, and one that has not been raised here was what the level of analysis is when you talk about future, because you start right away with a notion of a common future. But it's not that humanity that we are talking about only about the future of humanity, but you have your future, I have my future, we have desires, wishes on how our personal futures should look like, and to some extent we are able to influence that, make that true, and not necessarily we need to interact to make this happen, because go your way, I go my way. So and that works basically for most of the time for most of us, and it's only when some, let's say, collective problems come in, so that your future is somehow negatively interfering into my future, and what then? And there sort of we need to think about how this could be influenced. And And to me, it's when you then talk about, it's about imagination, and it's about creativity and prospective theorizing, that is all fine, but it's only when you think about all sorts of severe challenges for humanity. But when you don't focus on that, the rest is more or less can be handled, and it does every day. And to me, the question is, what is the relationship between those things that work as we experience it every day, and how we manage our futures in our own realms, and the thing that you are now imagining when you talk about desirable futures, because you propose that as if that would be something completely different, going on a very different planet, different from the day-to-day practice we live in. And I would challenge that, because also for a philosophical reason, I would say you cannot even imagine such a situation, but because once you start imagining it, you already build on what you have received, what you have learned, what you have experienced, so that you necessarily, for pragmatic reasons, but also for logical reasons, you are attached to the world you already live in. And that is, so to speak, the condition, for better or worse, that helps you, me, and the others to manage their future. So that, and also when we look at these challenges of humanity, this is also a condition we have to work on. And so that it is not, as you suggest, a completely different categorical thing, but I would suggest it's a gradual thing in terms of knowledge creation. Would be my comment, apart from these normative ethical reservations, which I've already told you once.
Thank you so much, Andreas. To your first point, future versus futures, I would partially agree. I think we all live on one planet, and this one planet is severely threatened by a climate emergency and by overshooting the planetary boundaries. And so I think, I mean, the planet is going to have a future, yes, but will humanity have a future? So, and I think we live on one planet, and we all kind of exposed to kind of different parts of the world more than others, but ultimately the climate future is something that, and I think that's the crisis you spoke about, that will affect us all. So, and on the other hand, I think common standards that, you know, we have over centuries developed as humankind around, you know, basic human rights, the SDGs. So I do think there is like, you know, there's like some parameters of a desirable futures that we can all agree with. And I think we are at the moment absolutely infringing on all parameters at the same time. So there's a lot of kind of the need to theorize of how can we safeguard some of these common denominators that humanity has agreed on. Within that, yes, I completely agree that, you know, it's not about, you know, one future that is desirable for everyone, but I think there's enough commonality and enough challenge for us to theorize how can we, you know, safeguard this common future for humanity that is a livable planet. And I think to your second point, yeah, I mean, I agree. We can't really. How can we theorize? How can we imagine what is not here yet? And my own background is in philosophy, and in philosophy, this idea of thought experiments plays a very important role. I think one of the theories that I was very inspired by is, for instance, John Rawls' The Veil of Ignorance, or also the concept of a basic income. And so philosophers think about these thought experiments and kind of derive normative principles for society, such as the basic income, that has now been actually implemented in certain experiments in different communities. But it starts as kind of a thought experiment of, what is a livable, how can we create a livable society? What should be kind of the rules and standards and principles of how we want to organize ourselves? And so I come a little bit from these ideas from philosophy, and I know you're also of course in business ethics and very familiar with this thinking in business ethics. And I mean, I would also think, your own work around political CSR, for instance, goes a bit into this direction, that it has kind of a normative grounding, and it has inspired a lot of work of scholars who kind of think about, okay, how can companies, become engage in kind of co-governance for, providing public goods. So yes, it's maybe it's not, not a binary move, but I think it's still a shift in how, we want to theorize this future orientation. And that's why, like Fridtjof's comment about, action orientation, what does it mean, for the world if we theorize? And I think that's maybe kind of a different orientation from, wanting to, represent the world, to actually building theories that can then also inspire action in the world. I think that's kind of the move, maybe. And that's, I think, is a move that maybe some of us already subscribe to, but I would argue the mainstream of academia, at least in my experience, is not subscribing to.
Do you want to proceed with the presentation, or one last raised hand?
Maybe the last raised hand by
Yes.
Ilona, and then we move on with the presentation.
Great.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Juliane, for being here and presenting your work. I read all your papers which you speak about today. They're obviously very curious. I would like to discuss more about cognitive knowledge base and theoretical base, which is available to scholars and people who are making thought experiments. So what I feel that there is a misconception of thinking about thought experiment as being a speculative tool to predict a future which is not known, rather than using the thought experiment through existing knowledge base.
Mm-hmm.
And if you read a paper by Herman Aguinis on recommendation for conducting thought experiments in organizational studies, the first precondition states that you need to have existing theory on which you would be making your decisions
Mm-hmm.
in order to speculate about the future.
Mm-hmm.
And when we speak about Einstein had a specific knowledge base on which he based his thought experiments. And probably if these thought experiments would be based on the different knowledge base, there would be different theory. So when you speak about future data sets and the labs where you can put different people from different categories with different values, probably the result of collective thought experiment on desirable future will be quite different based on the knowledge base existent within that lab. So I would like to hear your perspectives on this matter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank
you. Thanks so much. Science is very much a collective endeavor. So I think as with all scientific knowledge creation, it's kind of building on existing theorizing that has been there, trying to extend it, but maybe also challenging what has been there, and kind of offering different perspectives, maybe on the same phenomena that might be even, I don't want to say equally valid, but just provide different perspectives, different angle, different lenses that you can take. A zoom lens gives you like a different, different type of granularity, whereas if you have a wide lens, you can see more of the context. So similar to that, I think, it's not like there will be one thought experiment that is going to be the ultimate one, but it will be kind of a collective process on maybe developing each other's thought experiments and developing them further. So yes, for sure, it will create on existing knowledge bases, and if it takes a different stock of knowledge base, it might lead to a slightly different thought experiment. So I think that's the collective scientific endeavor that that very much I think will be at the heart of trying to theorize in prospective ways. Just to maybe the final thing to mention before I do move on with the final part of the presentation is a comment by Hong Qiu, if it would be beneficial for researchers to collaborate with science fiction authors to more effectively envision future scenarios. My colleague Annette Mikes, who is in accounting, is actually very actively engaging with Kim Stanley Robinson, who has written The Ministry for the Future. I don't know if you know that book, but it suggests kind of post-dystopian society, but where we have kind of a ministry that represents future interests. So we engage next week in a debate with Kim Stanley Robinson and a number of scholars from the sciences, from social sciences, to discuss exactly that. How can we use kind of science fiction to inspire theorizing? How can we combine it with science and so on? So I think that's a wonderful comment, and I think that's really interesting to also open up, what are the boundaries of our theorizing? Can this also lead to more interdisciplinary ways of theorizing? I really like that suggestion. Okay, so let me move to the final part that is going to address some of the questions that have been raised, namely around the validity of this form of theorizing. So how could we test? Well, we can't really test prospective theorizing, because we can't really test it against empirical reality unless we do action-oriented research. Then we could test it, because we could evaluate how desirable are the consequences that our theorizing creates. So for some forms it might be possible, but it might also require the development of different criteria. And if you think about qualitative scholars have often rejected criteria of positivism and have developed more criteria for interpretive validity of theories. So maybe we can do that as well, to kind of open up how we evaluate, how we assess theorizing through maybe what we could call speculative rigor. And the criteria for speculative rigor could be challenging these positive notions of objectivity, replicability, and instead kind of advocate for much more pragmatist and context-sensitive approach to understanding and also evaluating knowledge claims. And the first one would be around generative potency. And that's in line with pragmatist philosophy, that the theory is not evaluated against its ability to mirror or accurately represent a reality, but how useful it is to generate imagination about desirable futures. So it's more how much can it intervene in the world and inspire others to maybe apply the theory or to think differently about the world. Inspire new ways of thinking and seeing. Another criterion would be about process transparency. So if we use maybe imaginative forms of data. How have these forms of data been generated? What was the process? So we need a lot of reflexivity and transparency about the kind of nature of the imaginary data or the inputs to theorizing. And so we really need to be clear about that process transparency. In terms of the shift towards value, I think it very much then comes in, who was involved in theorizing, which and whose views were represented, what normative assumptions did we make, who participated, whose voices are considered, so I think so kind of to be able to be transparent to kind of normative scrutiny as well in the process of theorizing. The final criterion that we could think about is that around plausibility, speculative plausibility. Can we actually imagine that this theory that we came up with has some sort of plausibility? So Carl Weick talks about plausibility as a substitute for validity, and suggests that the contribution of social sciences does not lie in validated knowledge, but more in plausible knowledge. So it takes this idea of plausibility towards kind of future orientation. Is a circular economy, is that plausible? Is our theorizing around, I don't know, basic income, is that plausible? What is the logic and coherence of argumentation? And also, could we anchor our inferences in scientific knowledge, such as maybe the planetary boundaries, which are very much science-based, or the Paris Agreement that committed the world to limit climate change to an increase in temperature of 1.5 degrees Celsius is not a political decision. 1.5 degrees is the scientific consensus of what is a safe amount of warming. So moving from 1.5 to 2%, that's a political decision. The science tells us 1.5%. So that's how we could have some sort of scientific guardrails where we could anchor our claims in. A similar thing I mentioned briefly earlier is around what is plausibly desirable. So guardrails such as human rights, considerations of intergenerational justice, which I think are very much missing from policy making, from businesses, but maybe also from how we theorize around the world. And finally, around ideas of promoting the common good. So maybe a pledge towards the promotion of the common good. So, I mean, these are kind of suggestions of what speculative rigor could look like. It might not be that all criteria are fulfilled, but that rigor is enhanced the more different criteria are fulfilled in prospective theorizing. And it's more kind of not a tick box, but maybe more as a guiding principle. And that kind of provide guidance to kind of a collective scientific endeavor. Okay, to wrap up and end on implications of prospective theorizing. So you rightly asked me, what does it mean? What are examples of prospective theorizing? And I think this is very much a collective endeavor of collectively trying to figure out how this could look like. How could we push the boundaries of our theorizing towards, maybe, going more into some directions that have already been paved, but maybe also trying out more imaginative forms of theorizing itself. With the aim to kind of, if we want to have impact as scholars, impacting the world in positive ways, how can we co-create new institutional imaginaries, new business models, new alternative, and create that impactful theory by co-creating desirable futures, by theorizing them. I think then collectively we need to decide as a community of science, social scientists, organizational theorists, how do we want to judge our theories? You know, what criteria shall reviewers of our output look at when they're going to evaluate prospective theorizing? And they cannot be based, if they're based on imagination, they cannot be tested against the empirical presence. So hence the need to kind of open up these criteria of what we think is, you know, rigorous and valid scientific knowledge. And so with this, I want to kind of stop the presentation part, and we have about 9 minutes left for further questions. And I will very welcome your additional questions, feedback, thoughts. And thanks so much for having such an active chat with all the resources that you already suggested. These are fantastic, and I will look at all of them later on as well. Ignas, I think I see your hand being up the first.
Yeah, thanks. So I really loved your paper at OT, and I think it speaks to a lot of important issues we have in our field, and is providing a lot of really interesting suggestions. So thanks a lot for that. I was a little bit wondering while reading it, where does ethics come in? I was missing this a little bit, because I mean, you speak to normativity, rightly so, and then kind of coming up with something that is supposed to be plausibly desirable is an act of ethical reflection.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we can do this based on lay theories of ethics, but I mean, there is a canon of scholarly work that we could simply, or which should need to integrate, and there's been calls for this, like every 10 years, I think, within organization studies, to say we need to engage with the ethics register. We need to incorporate this not into our work beyond ontological and epistemological reflections, also have like ethical reflection as a standard in what we do. And still, I feel that kind of ethical literacy is not taken for granted in management studies. And so I wanted to hear what's your take on this and how this could be elaborated further. And just as another thought or idea, while I was listening to you, I thought of the distinction that Mittelstrass made between disposition knowledge and orientation knowledge. And maybe imaginary futures is also something that kind of relates to that, saying, well, disposition knowledge is not everything that we need. And I think what you're talking about is a lot about orientation knowledge in order towards orienting ourselves towards futures that we can legitimately judge desirable.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, I think that's a very nice reference. I think you're absolutely right. It's more producing knowledge for orientation, and it kind of goes back to the question, you know, what is knowledge? What is the purpose of theorizing? And, you know, going back to Habermas, what are the different knowledge interests as well? And so thinking about orientation, and I thanks so much. If you can, for everyone, share the reference, I think that would be really useful. Yeah.
It is in German though, but I'm happy to share it.
And on the business ethics one, Andreas, I saw your hand up because as a business ethicist, I wonder if you wanted to respond to that one. Now you don't have your hand up anymore, but
it was actually an applause. So.
Oh, okay, yeah.
But
yeah.
I mean, to make this concrete, it was when you had this chart on value neutral versus value-led claim, and there you said there should be counteracting dominance of Western values and embrace alternative imaginaries on institutions. And there immediately I thought about Mr. Putin. He would very much support this idea, resisting Western value, thinking in alternative institutional frameworks. But we may perhaps feel uncomfortable about his desirable futures. And it's not only his. I mean, he had an election and has a big majority, even from voters who live outside Russia. So what we somehow need, and this adds to what Ignas Bruder has said, we need a qualifier to say, yeah, it's about good and bad futures. Because when you talk about desirable, it means always, yeah, there are either individuals or certain collectives that have certain desires, wishes, and so on. But this is not necessarily the good futures that can be shared by all, and therefore, coming from let's say desires to good futures, you need justifications, and this is something that we in org studies have looked on only when we look at questions of truth, but not sufficiently when we look at ethical questions, of questions of rightness, and that is something that we need, and this would, I suggest, make the approach that you develop here complete then.
Thank you. I think that's a really valuable comment. And I think this engagement with ethics and business ethics, I think there's a lot we can learn. I mean, I used to be together with you, Andreas, associate editor at Business Ethics Quarterly, where I think there's like a truly interdisciplinary journal where it's kind of the only journal in our discipline that actually really takes the ethical aspects and ethical reflection seriously, and that allows scholars to also make normative claims and normative suggestions in their papers. So, but I really like that point. I really take that challenge on board. Not all desirable futures are good futures. So, yeah, thank you. The last point, John.
Yes, hello. Yeah, I just wonder, I mean, for instance, the idea of degrowth, right? Where you think about organizing our economies in another way that releases less carbon, right? So you could say, okay, that might be one of those ideas you're talking about. But I mean, there are a lot of political interests related to such an idea as well, right? So you can say, what is the power relationship in your way of thinking about these things? I mean, who are allowed to suggest these, do this prospective theorizing? Is it scientists who are supposed to do that in order to give ideas about how to form the future? I mean, how do we interact with the political actors in the political systems? I suppose some of them will like some of the ideas compared to other ideas, right? And perhaps degrowth is not on the agenda among certain politicians, right? So we have this power aspect of the prospective theorizing, right? That is quite important, I think. So I would like to ask you about your ideas or thinking, how you think about those things. Also, I mean, who are the legitimate producers of prospective theories, right? That would be the question. Another question is how to go from abstract to concrete, right? In design thinking, you have abstract ideas, you try them out, you build solutions through prototyping, right? Rapid prototyping, and then you find out what actually works, right? So how can you assure that the prospective theorizing will actually work if you try to actually build some of these theoretically imagined solutions, right? So I mean, is there a connection there to design thinking, and do we need actually to have prospective theorizing and design thinking going hand in hand in order to succeed with these things? I don't know whether you have any views on that. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe just briefly, because in the interest of time, love these points. I think this opens up so many questions that I think who can do prospective theorizing? I think we should not kind of undervalue the opportunity that we have as scholars to be kind of conveners of such debates, and also have kind of the luxury of actually having this time that we can engage in such reflections. Lots of practitioners who are at the coalface of many of the challenges, they simply don't have the time to really engage in these sorts of questions. So I just want to not answer these questions here, but really say that this is a collective endeavor where I think hopefully kind of in the years to come, you know, you will kind of maybe be inspired to come on this journey and kind of help, you know, answer some of these questions, and kind of, you know, build out what prospective theorizing is. I mean, it's not me or anyone who, you know, owns this. I think it's really, you know, is for our kind of community to determine whether this is something we want to do, and if yes, how this looks like. And I think as we hear, there's so many different challenges yet to be met. But thank you so much. This has been such a wonderful opportunity, and really thought-provoking questions you had as well. I'm handing back to Joseph, who will wrap us up, I think.
Thank you very much, Juliane. I think that's something we can really agree upon, that there is too many interesting questions that follow from your provoking discussion. I want to thank you very much for this presentation that you gave. I want to thank everyone else for joining and for interacting so much today. And then I'm indeed wrapping up this discussion, but I'm sure there will be lots of others to follow. Thank you.